Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья.
Good afternoon, dear friends. Online conference City for All Wellbeing, Health, Sustainability continues its work. We are in the Resilient City track, and now there is a discussion ahead of us, the Resilient City, how cities can invest in enhancing resilience. My name is Angelina Davidova. I'm environmental journalist, director of the Environmental Information Bureau, the person who's been dealing with the sustainable development for many years. The climate change issues is also in my responsibility. Our topic, the resilience of cities, is very up to date. It's up to date because we are still on top of the pandemic. Cities live now hard times and experience hard times. We're all trying to find new ways out, but behind the crisis of pandemic, we shouldn't miss another crisis. The climatic crisis, the climate change issues are becoming more and more acute and critical for cities because on one hand, cities are sources of greenhouse gases and one of the main reasons for climate change is in the planet. On the other hand, cities also suffer under climate change. And so the issues of climate adaptations and issues of strengthening resilience of cities also become key issues for the city development. Very many cities in the world start developing their climatic plans, and we will discuss this too within our discussion. Some cities still begin to work on that. Some cities have already some experience. Cities also unite in associations to share the experience, to tell more what results they have, what solutions they can offer and deploy on the technical level, both on technical and managerial level, and also by involving opinions and taking into account opportunities and interests of the citizens. So issues of climate adaptation and issues of strengthening resilience of cities is, of course, issues of the future. And at the moment of the restoration of city economies, climate resiliency and adaptation are always the factors which we will have to take into account when we will recover and restore the city economies. So all these issues and problems and challenges we will discuss during this hour with our speakers. Now I'd like to introduce to you our speakers, the participants of the session. Anton Kubachevsky, head of the Moscow Department for Environmental Management and Protection of Moscow. Sadhu Johnston, city manager of Vancouver. Rachel Huxley, director of knowledge and learning, C40. Gerhard Schmidt, director, Singapore ATG Center, lead principal investigator, Cooling Singapore project. And Jan Gale, architect, founder of Gale Architects. Dear friends, we have the following schedule. We expect that every speaker will have around 7 minutes for presentation, and then we will have time for final discussion within which we can handle a few questions, which we will have. In the meantime, you do your presentations. So first, I'd like to give the floor to Rachel Huxley, Director of Knowledge and Learning, C40. C40 is an association of pioneering cities in the area of climate changes. These are cities which set more stretched targets than their countries to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, and those are the cities which develop their plans to adapt to climate change, to strengthen their resilience. These are cities which cooperate between each other, share experience. These, of course, it's a very important unification and the organization of cities which works at UN level, national level, and municipalities. Rachel, I give the floor to you, and I'd like to ask you the following question. What programs of improving the resilience of cities C40 is now working? What examples can you cite of your work? What are the most interesting and exciting cases to fight negative aftermath of climate change you can share with us and tell us more about? Please.
Thank you. I'm just going to set up my presentation. Hopefully you can see that fine. Thank you so much for that introduction. As you've said, sort of C40 is a network of cities. We're led by mayors for mayors, and we represent 97 of the world's largest cities with over around 700 million citizens and over 25% of GDP. And I was asked to talk about how cities can respond to the increasing kind of extreme weather we're seeing as a result of climate change. But first of all, I really wanted to briefly say, why cities need to respond to this. It's an obvious but very important point. Cities really are at the coalface, if you like, of climate change, and they're experiencing the impacts now. So 98% of our cities have already reported that this is hitting them, and it's hitting them hard. As we've sort of said as a network all along, the battle for climate change will be won or lost in cities, and that's mitigation and adaptation. So then turning to the actual question I was asked, how can cities respond to climate change and increasing extreme weather? Well, again, these are obvious but very important points. Cities need to start by understanding and identifying the hazards that they're facing, by assessing who's, what the risk is, and that's in two kind of key questions here. Who's at risk? And for your city, that might be about kind of some particularly vulnerable population. So, for example, Rotterdam has mapped their vulnerable populations in thinking about heat, in particular elderly citizens. And Jakarta's identified at-risk citizens, particularly looking at flooding and some of their informal settlements. And as well as understanding who's at risk, cities really need to know what's at risk in terms of assets and systems in their cities. So another couple of examples from our cities in New York, their 5 boroughs report identified that roads and bridges were a really key asset, and that any climate impact to these might have a kind of cascading impact on some of their key services, such as food distribution. And in Amsterdam, they identified a particular area of the city where there was a concentration of really important assets, for example, energy generation and pumping stations. So that was important for them in terms of understanding how they needed to protect their city and their key services, and how essentially they could keep their city running. Of course, once cities have identified hazards and assessed risk, then they need to act. And for that, it's really important that they prioritize, because none of our cities have all the resources that they need to do everything. So they have to prioritize. And it's really important that equity and inclusivity are taken into account in that process. So understanding how the costs and benefits of climate adaptation are going to be distributed, who's going to benefit from that protection, and making sure that the most marginalized and the most vulnerable are protected. You also asked me to talk about what programs we provide to help our cities. So I just wanted to quickly outline a few of the things that we do to support C40 cities. The first is really making the case, so providing the evidence that cities need to get political and financial support to take adaptation action. So we undertook research in The Future We Don't Want, producing a report that showed how climate risk was going to increase in cities over the next 50 years. We also looked not just at individual risks, but in our interdependencies report, we looked at how risks might combine, and cities would be facing kind of interdependent cascading impacts from climate action. We produced recently a tool around how cities can avoid health impacts from extreme heat. And we're also looking at the impact of flooding and drought in terms of what are the social and economic costs. So all of these things provide cities with the data and the evidence that they need to understand and make the case for climate action. We produced and developed a whole load of resources and tools for planning and helping cities to plan adaptation action. So just to mention a couple of these, the heat health tool I've already talked about, a particular guidance we produced around monitoring, evaluating and reporting so that cities can understand the progress of adaptation and the impact that that's having. And we've also set up adaptation academies and a climate action planning program to provide support tailored to city needs on action planning, on implementing and mainstreaming, and on monitoring and evaluating. And finally, one of the key things that we do at C40, it's sort of the beating heart of our organization, is connecting cities so that they can talk to each other, they can share problems, and they can share, importantly, solutions. So you can see here on the right a number of networks. And just giving an example of how that happens, we've recently held a virtual conference, and Cape Town shared some of their work that they've been doing around greening and cooling solutions. Tel Aviv and Athens shared how they've been setting targets and securing financing and citizen support to then take action towards those targets. So a really important facet of what we do is bring cities together and share the solutions that they're innovating in real time. Then thinking about some of the examples of urban management practices that can reduce the negative impact and minimize the risk of climate hazards, we're at the moment doing some research with McKinsey, and we've been looking at what are the priority adaptation actions that cities can take. Obviously, there's a wealth of things they can do, but what might be some of the most important and impactful ones? And we're thinking about and grouping adaptation actions into these 5 areas. So thinking about nature-based solutions, things like green space and tree planting, rain gardens and river restoration. And to give an example, Medellin's Green Corridor program is looking at designating areas across Medellin to increase green space and tree cover, and reducing the temperature, providing shade, and reducing health risks from extreme heat. In terms of grey defences, this is things like cool pavements, seawalls and floodgates. A great example is Copenhagen and their cloudburst street planning strategy, putting in a range of sustainable drainage systems across the city. Thinking about policies and regulation, this is things like land use zoning and building codes. An example here from Cape Town of their coastal management lines, which have been introduced to prohibit or restrict the construction or maintenance of structures seaward of the line. And thinking about optimizing responses, so building awareness through heat campaigns and warning systems, for example. We can look at the city of Paris that's designed and developed an interactive cooling center map, so citizens can locate emergency centers when they need to. And finally, thinking about building in redundancy, so making sure that cities have backup supplies. And an example here is from New York. During Hurricane Sandy, their hospitals were operating on backup generators. So just making sure you've got the capacity to keep the city running. I'm conscious of time, so I'll quickly go through the next couple of slides. I just wanted to flag here that our cities and our work, like everyone else's over the last year, has been dominated by the pandemic. And we've looked very much at how our cities can recover in a green and just way after COVID-19. And this has focused on the vulnerabilities that the pandemic has highlighted and the interdependencies in our system that the pandemic has highlighted. So we know we need to be more resilient. And you can see here on the left-hand side that resilience is a key part of our recovery agenda. And likewise, building back with nature. So we're seeing some really good synergies in terms of what the pandemic's highlighted and is going to call from us and what we need to do from an adaptation perspective anyway. Finally, we were asked to think about how and why climate and weather conditions should be taken into account by planning, constructing and designing cities, public spaces and green areas. So I just wanted to finish with 3 examples that kind of came to mind. You know, cities need to plan their construction and city designs around not just the climate hazards they're facing today, but the climate hazards that they'll face in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And an example of this is the climate resiliency design guidelines in New York. They incorporate projected climate data into the design of all of the capital projects, and they provide a consistent methodology to do so. And that underlying data comes from the New York City Panel on Climate Change. So a really fantastic example there. The second thing I wanted to share was around how important it is to integrate real-time reporting and data into operations. And here we can look at the Rio city and their center of operations, where real-time weather communications are kind of shared with all city services, so they can respond very quickly if there's a risk of heavy rainfall and flooding, for example. And the last area, of course, that we would recommend that kind of cities and everyone really invests in terms of adaptation is nature-based solutions. Again, referencing the work that we've done on a green and just recovery from a post-pandemic perspective, and how important nature-based solutions will be. And an example there is the city of Rotterdam and how they've invested in 7 green space projects as part of their post-COVID response. And these projects will not only increase Rotterdam's resilience, but they'll provide jobs, healthy housing and healthy environments. Thank you very much, and sorry to run a little bit over.
Спасибо большое, Рэйчел. Спасибо за ваше выступление.
Rachel, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. We now know how C40 organization works, and we're happy to hear your specific cases. We learned about policies from different cities which are aimed at improving sustainability of cities. This experience is very valuable, and as you've correctly pointed, that's great that you work as the hub of information which contains all this information, all this data, and now cities can share this data, can share this information, they can learn from each other, they can learn new things, they can understand what works better and what doesn't work so well, and in which areas they can improve. Now I give the floor to Anton Kulbachevsky from Moscow. It's the northern megalopolis. More than 10 million people live here. Moscow is also a member of the C40 associations. Anton, are these topics of adaptation to the climate change, improving resilience, are topical for Moscow? And what are you doing with this regard? Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm very happy to see all of you at the Urban Forum platform. Unfortunately, we didn't have possibility to meet in face-to-face, but I'll try to tell you about our plans and our actions which we are implementing right now. We want to see resilient city. In case of snowstorms, this city provides all the power and all the warmth for the cities, as well as safe roads. Sustainability city, it's one of the 17 sustainability development goals of the UN, and Moscow is developing with the global values hand in hand. For improving resilience, we have all the actions planned in our national programs. As from the vulnerability point of view, Moscow is a really unique city because we have heat waves in the summer and we have very cold weather in winter. We have lots of rain and we have lots of temperatures crossing zero line. In order to mitigate these difficult consequences of climate, we decided that we need to have the warning system warning about unfavorable weather conditions from the meteorological point of view. For example, zero wind and problems with accumulation of detrimental emissions. According to the action plan, which was approved several years ago, which is working with the consequences of heat waves and very cold weather. Our agencies monitor temperature and the concentration of particles. As a result, they send out recommendations to all the necessary relevant services. We ensure safety of the city infrastructure. Energy complex also sees the reduction of the vulnerability of all the systems and infrastructure. Gas system is now one of the most reliable systems in Moscow. For 9 years, we've been working without any emergency blackouts. We have high-quality electricity and power by 99% throughout the city. We do not have any problem with water supply. As for the sewage systems and treatment facilities, our capacity is 39%, which is a good number. We have very rigid limits for other services as well. The liquidation of the slippery roads shouldn't be more than 5 hours since the end of the snow falling. This is a good regulation. This is a good standard. It's rather difficult to keep up with it, but we are usually working within this limit. And 5 hours after the snow fall stopped, we ensure safe roads for our citizens. As for updating the housing complexes, renovation, as we call it in Russian. We are building new houses for our population, for about 1 million people. We are building new houses right now. They will get new housing of classes not below the B class. This also requires additional power supply. We are saving 20 to 30% here with new houses. In new houses have 20% more power efficiency, and we will reduce 48 kilograms of bad emissions per year per house. We will have a new industry of adaptation to climate changes. We have new group of products, such as products which help us to ensure diagnosis, materials and technologies for managing the microclimate in houses. So this is a new industry. And let's think also about some benefits for cities when they implement all the new technologies. According to experts, when we build this future infrastructure, we can get profit of $17 trillion by 2030. And the private sector or businesses, they are also important here. They are first to take up green technologies. They are main emitters of greenhouse gases. And if we are building greenhouses, this can change the situation a lot. We have R&D activities for assessing efficiency of such activities. For example, with regards to Class A buildings and business centers. Such business centers of the newer generations, they save lots of energy and they reduce maintenance responses by 4.5 million rubles per year. And in some buildings, it's possible to save up to 8 million rubles per year. Introduction of new technologies, that goes also very rapidly. If we're talking about sustainability, globally, if we want to make the city sustainable, it should be attractive to the most active people, to youngest generations. We need to maintain clever people here, and we need to create a city attractive for new people to live here. We need to have good transportation system, and in Moscow it's rather modernized. We've built more than 1,000 kilometers of new roads in a couple of years. We have 12 main highways, 17 new crossroads, and lots of crossroads without traffic lights. We have 92 new objects commissioned, road objects. And congestion improved. The speed increased from 17 to 28 kilometers per hour during peak periods. And we will achieve the reduction of congestion in the air and greenhouse gas emissions. Since 2011, in Moscow, we have 301 new kilometers of metro lines, 145 stations, including the Moscow Central Road, metro stations. So Moscow Central Road, it used to be the railroad line. Now this is something similar to the metro, and it is used by 1 million Muscovites per day. Cycling infrastructure, it's 850 kilometers of cycling roads, 629 stations for renting bikes, and a huge amount of city bikes. We have achieved breakthrough in the latest 10 years. I was recommended by our foreign experts to start this bicycle program, and now lots of people use bicycle not just for sport, for leisure, but people use bicycles for going to work. Air quality improved, and average annual concentration of carbon reduced significantly. The most important in our climatic agenda is to maintain the natural green zones in the city. When the climate is changing, we need to develop the green infrastructure. When we have green zones, they are more energy efficient. If we compare them with artificial spaces, they reduce energy spent of the city. Green zones reduce negative effect of the heat from the city, improve humidity by 15%, and it can give us the feel of the reduction of the temperature from 3 to 6 degrees Celsius. We continue to develop infrastructure, green infrastructure. Now, 50% of all the space of Moscow, that's green spaces. 90% of Muscovites have access to green territories, and it's in the walking distance. According to our program, since 2011, we planted more than 8.5 million trees and shrubs. Your time is almost up. Yes, I have just 20 seconds to finish my presentation. We have special programs such as 1 million trees or My Tree. We have special territories which are protected, reserves. This should be something surprising to have in a megalopolis, but we do have 19,000 hectares of reserves, and we've created 26 new territories with this status this year. As for the international cooperation, Moscow is the only city in Russia which is the member of the C40 Association. And last year we've signed a declaration which is titled Green and Healthy Streets. We participate in another project which is devoted to disclosure information on greenhouse gas emissions. And in Moscow, Moscow is a city of category A. There are 88 cities in total in this list out of 491 who submitted a report, and we continue to do such changes which we started 10 years ago, and we are very sure that the future will be bright and healthy, and our city will be prepared for climate change. Anton, thank you very much for this comprehensive picture about the situation in Moscow, main risks, main progress, plans for the future, and also you mentioned some international projects. This is great. It's important to exchange information with foreign colleagues, with people from different cities. This is our main topic today. And let's leave Moscow and let's move on to another continent, to Vancouver. And Sadhu Johnston will be presenting the city. He's a city manager of Vancouver. Before becoming a city manager in Vancouver, he was responsible for the climatic action plan in the Northern America, and this is a plan for Chicago. They are both northern cities with extremely low temperatures, and they do suffer from negative climate change consequences. My question to you: What are you doing in Vancouver right now? What are your main priorities in adaptation to climate change? And what can you do right now? Are there some possible plans for the future?
Wonderful, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and great presentations so far. So I'd like to share with you the experience in Vancouver, and I'm going to share my screen here to make sure that you can see my images. So I hope you can see that. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that Vancouver is located on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, who were displaced during the process of colonialism and who we work with closely in our work to make Vancouver a resilient community. So this is, you can see we're right on the ocean. We're on the west coast of North America. And we are very, very attuned to the impacts that climate change will have on our community and that it's already having on our community. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing on resiliency and tell you about our recent plan and how we're implementing it. So firstly, you heard during the presentation from Moscow about the work that we can do to reduce climate impacts, and that's what we call avoidable, avoid the unmanageable. And so we're doing a lot to reduce our carbon emissions and have a very, very aggressive plans to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and reduce carbon pollution.
Саду, извините, пожалуйста, мы не видим вашей презентации сейчас.
Sadhu, sorry, we cannot see your presentation right now. Could you do something? Now we can. Thank you.
Okay.
Да,
Can you see it again?
Да, спасибо.
Now everything is fine. Thank you. Yes, we can see.
Okay, didn't change anything. On the right, you can see adaptation. So what we are doing to reduce the impact that climate change will have on our community. And of course, in the middle are the things that benefit both. And those are the best initiatives because you can reduce your climate emissions, but you can also become a more resilient city. And we need to recognize, as the Insurance Bureau of Canada has told us, that the cost of inaction is extremely high. So in Canada, we're recognizing that $1 spent to prepare for climate change can save about $5 on average. So these investments are very wise investments for the future of our cities, for the future of our species, as a matter of fact. So for Vancouver, one example, just to put it into context here, we used to have the best air quality in the world. We're right on the ocean. We're very efficient as a community generally. But with climate change, you can see the forest fires in the areas around Vancouver are having a huge impact on our air quality. So you can see it just started to go up in the last decade. And over the last several summers, we've had very, very poor air quality because of all of these fires outside of Vancouver. And some of them are many, many miles away that we can't have an impact on putting them out. We're dealing with them, but the forests are burning and that's impacting our air quality. And when those changes happen in our community, they disproportionately impact people and groups and particular neighborhoods. Largely, it's the disadvantaged neighborhoods. But it's impacting all neighborhoods, but differently in different neighborhoods, depending on the amount of trees that they might have and the other environmental conditions in those particular communities. So it's not the same across our city. So in 2012, we adopted our adaptation strategy, and that mapped out hundreds of initiatives that we would undertake to be more prepared as a community. And in 2018, we updated that action plan. As you can see on the pillars of some of our bridges, we're indicating what the sea level rise will look like in our own city to educate our residents about that. So I'd like to tell you about our 2018 plan. In terms of the hazards that we're planning for, poor air quality, I told you a moment ago, we were seeing that go up. Heat waves, more extreme heat in the summers. We're expecting increased coastal and urban flooding. And so we expect the sea level rise and extreme storms to impact the coast, but also then a lot of rain to come and impact the urban flooding as well. And then, of course, more extreme events. As a city manager, there's lots of emergencies we have all of the time. We're always adapting to various things, but this is one of those that we see coming, and we need to be preparing for it. So our plan maps out our roadmap for doing that. The plan is made up of core actions. You can see the 6 core actions there, and you heard from our earlier speakers. Understanding the impact for your own community is critical. So number 1 is the projections, understanding what the projections are. And then number 2 is assessing the vulnerabilities and looking at the gaps. What are the things that we need to address in our own communities? And then develop action plans and think about the co-benefits. How can we improve the quality of life, the health, the reduction of carbon emissions? And then number 5 is implement it. And then 6 is to monitor how we're doing in those actions. And then of course go about updating our plan like we did in 2018. So I want to give you a few examples in Vancouver of what this looks like. Our 5 main areas you can see there, the coastline, looking at our buildings, looking at our natural assets, as you heard earlier from Rachel, many cities are doing, and then looking at our communities and the health impact, and then natural systems. And I'll just give you a few examples in each of those areas. The natural systems in this case being, of course, the coastline. Now, green infrastructure, you heard about Copenhagen has been doing great work on, and Rachel talked about other cities. This is just one example. If we have to rebuild a street, let's rebuild the street to adapt to climate change. Let's not just build the same street we've always been building. So this is an example of one project. It's a very small one, 1.2 kilometers. And in the process, you can see on the left, we build a trench, and that trench ensures that the roots for the trees that will be planted can go all along the entire street, not just be in one little box. And then in the middle, you can see there that we build rainwater infiltration so that the root barriers have a place to be protected and the rainwater can filter in. And then on the right, you can see we put permeable pavers in so the water, when it rains, can filter into that root trench. And so that's one example of how one little street can have a long-term impact and ensure that those trees will survive, thereby keeping the city cooler. Our buildings, of course, need to be adapted as well. Energy efficiency, like you heard about in Moscow, is a very, very important step. We're also looking at the rooftops. How can our rooftops absorb the stormwater and help to cool the city? So green roofs are a very, very important part of the strategy. If you look around at the bird's eye view of any city, rooftops are very prevalent. So absorbing stormwater and keeping the city cool with green roofs is a very important opportunity for us. And of course, you can grow food up there as well, and you can create natural habitat. And as you're rebuilding those streets, this is an example of a street that was originally just for cars. Now we have a bike lane there, we have a pedestrian path, and we have bioswales to absorb the stormwater, natural habitat to support wildlife. So each street that you rebuild, each neighborhood, you can integrate many of these strategies as you go. It doesn't need to all be additive. As you're doing your work, you can integrate some of these elements. So bioswales absorb the stormwater, create natural habitat. They also filter the rainwater, the runoff from the streets before it goes into the ocean. Now we're engaging our residents in this work as well. This is a citizen heat mapping process. The hottest day of the year, we give residents heat detecting equipment, and they ride around the city, and we can track and monitor heat across the entire city. So engaging our residents in this work is very, very important. They learn about it, they communicate with their neighbors. And this is an example of a sea level rise challenge. Again, we're engaging our residents so that they can help us to do our work, but also to learn about it. And so this is educating our residents about the work that is happening with False Creek, or the very important waterway in our community. So you can see there, someone born today will experience 1 meter of sea level rise by the time they're 80 years old. This is a very fundamental change to our city. We have about $25 billion worth of real estate assets right on the coastline. So we need to be ensuring that we're protecting that infrastructure. Now, as I close out here, I've highlighted a number of the different areas, but what I'd like to say is that the layering of those together, thinking about the city holistically, taking an equity lens to understand how particularly low-income people are impacted, more vulnerable people are impacted, but thinking about this from a multi-hazard approach. how do these things layer together? How does one thing impact so many other things? How do we understand urban heat island effect? So the hottest parts of the city with those that are most vulnerable with where we plant trees. And in this map, you can see the areas with the trees are the coolest, the areas without the trees are the hottest, and those also happen to be the areas where we have the most low-income people. So understanding and mapping all of these layers is very important, not just looking at one thing at a time. So this work in our cities is absolutely critical. We are members of C40, as I mentioned. If you don't know about it, look it up. There's incredible resources. We get to work with our peers across the world in making our cities even better. So thank you so much. And I really want to thank the Moscow Urban Forum for hosting this very important conversation. I hope you keep up the good work in Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sadhu. Thank you very much for this holistic picture, as you mentioned it, of both challenges and future risks which Vancouver expects, and specific solutions which are being underway or planned to be implemented. And climate change problem is a systematic problem. Climate change is not about temperature only. It's about the precipitation level, changes of life and activity of ecosystems, and many other changes which have very small steps, but they very steadily integrate with our cities. And the solutions should be also comprehensive and overwhelming. I'd like to pass the floor now to Gerhard Schmidt. Gerhard, you are working both in Europe and Southeast Asia. It's clear that risks and the challenges which you face due to climate changes are different. But how different are the solutions? What could you share from your experience about this?
Gerhard, вы слышите нас?
Gerhard, can you hear us? Gerhard, can you hear us?
Так, мы видим вашу презентацию.
We can see your presentation. That's fine. Very good.
Мы пока вас не слышим.
But unfortunately, we can't hear you.
Is it okay now?
Да, я сейчас слышу ваш голос.
Yes, we can hear your voice now.
Thank you. I'm talking to you from the machine room, so to say, because we are in Singapore and trying to build what we call a digital urban climate twin, because we found out that every city has its own DNA. And this is very important to remember. Every city is so different, even in the same country, and they react differently to different shocks. We have a big program on what is called future resilient systems, and there we study the behavior of resilient systems and what they do. And now in the COVID situation, of course, we have this big shock that happened, and depending on how smart and how responsive the cities are, they will come out better from this shock or worse than before. Some might even collapse. The same is true for earthquakes and other shocks. You can see here the program that we run in Singapore is very large. It's on future cities that's going since 2010. Then it's this big program on future resilient systems, then on digital health, on cooling Singapore and natural capital Singapore. So they're all focused on the urban questions and to make cities and urban systems more resilient. We try to approach that from the scientific side, but also from the design side. So we make postulates, what we want to have or where we want to be in Singapore. We want to have high outdoor thermal comfort, clean air, clean industry, and less noise and renewable energy and circular economy. All these things do not exist to the degree that we need them to have in the future now. And then we study the scientific means how to do that. Singapore is no better off than any other city in the world. You can see the global heat increase, of course, from left to right, and you can see Switzerland, and you can also see Singapore. Here we can see the temperature rising in Singapore. The average temperature we think in 2200 will be around 31, 32 degrees. It's already more than 28 degrees now. So everything that comes on top of it is very bad. In the past, let's say 100 years ago, we had these beautiful villas being built, but then the temperature was 3-4 degrees cooler, and you could absorb the heat and mitigate and adapt to the heat with architecture. Now architecture is doing almost the opposite, because they're building these large buildings, very dense, very high. But you can see on the high rises, like everywhere in the world, you have these individual cooling stations. These cooling stations produce hot air by sucking hot air out of the apartment, ejecting it to the outside. So at the top of these buildings, you have air temperatures of up to 60, 70 degrees, which is very insufficient and very bad for the environment altogether. That causes, of course, is one of the causes of the urban heat island effect from the rural to the urban with the peak, and that peak can be up to 7 degrees in Singapore. With the Cooling Singapore initiative, we're trying to integrate and have a holistic approach to address this urban heat challenge. It's not only for Singapore, but for other cities around the world to increase their resilience. And we want to develop this particular program to be exportable to everybody and to use it. It's open source, of course. Every city has its own DNA, as I said in the beginning. You can see that from the Sankey diagram of every city. Here in Singapore, for example, it's almost entirely fossil-based. On the left, the input, on the right, where it's used, you can see a very big part of it is used in industry, transport, and buildings, relatively little. This is completely different than in Switzerland, for example. In Singapore, we managed to make a 300 by 300 meter grid. So Singapore is quite small, 700 square kilometers. And in this grid, then we can insert the different heat sources. Here, the transportation at a certain time of the day, which can add to 1 and 2 degrees of the total heat in the city in these areas. And more important, we do hour-by-hour simulations. Here you can see the urban heat island development during the day. This is 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. You see the watch on the left. Now at 6 o'clock, the cars are driving to work, and you can see incredible heat ejection they have into the city. Then at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, some sea breezes are coming from the south, and it's get a bit cooler, but then 2, 3, 4 o'clock already it's heating up again. And of course, then the cars are driving home again at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And then the really ugly effect of the urban heat island starts to work, because the heat is rejected from the buildings, re-radiating into the cities, and exactly where people are living, it gets very uncomfortably hot. This is where they really are suffering. The same is true for other cities with this heat island effect. That makes us make different vulnerability maps for the city, of course, where to live, where not to live, where to run, where not to run. And with this digital urban climate twin, we are now able to simulate almost any scenario for district cooling, for solar panels, for electric vehicles, and compare that directly to the measured temperatures and conditions that we have in reality. This urban climate twin is very interactive. We want to make it in a big interactive system, technically quite complex, but as I said, all open source, integrated some commercial programs. Most of them, however, are open source. In the end, we want to give to every city like a big thermometer, and then the city government, the city citizens can turn this thermometer, but they must know what happens and what they have to do. They have to consider not only materials and surfaces, they have to use energy systems, different ones. They have to consider vegetation, shading, transport, urban geometry, water features. And then they can see, of course, the impact on the environment, the economy, the health, and the costs of the whole system. And this we want to export everywhere. The most important part of it is, however, the citizens. So we call this citizen design science with the citizens. They have done that over hundreds of years. Here, the example from Florence. We want that in use in the new developments, like in Singapore and other cities as well. We give them digital tools with which they can design the city and calculate also get the feedback how the city will perform in terms of heat island effect. And we can see that the citizens using these tools are doing an incredible job and are very, very sensitive and very, very good observers of the real situation. So rather than top down, we let people work from inside out. The same we will do also in Zurich. We have already started. So it will be a worldwide digital urban climate twin that we want to share with all cities. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Gerhard.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Thank you for your examples from Singapore and from Zurich. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Jan Gale, architect, founder of Gale Architects. Gale, could you tell us, please, what solutions architects and developers use in the world to adapt to climate change and to reinforce the resilience of the cities?
Does it work?
Да, мы видим вашу презентацию, все в порядке.
Yes, it works. Thank you.
I'm very impressed by hearing all these very interesting stories from various parts of the world. I think that there is in every city great work being done by specialists in climate adaptation and foreseeing the climate, and I'm very impressed. I'm not one of those. I'm almost just a citizen who have made some observations, and I will share these observations. I told earlier on today in this urban forum about the city of Copenhagen, city of 1.5 million people, which have done a lot to change the traffic place into a people place. They worked it in for 58 years. I showed these maps that in 1962 there was just one street without traffic or one street for people. Now it's very dominant in the city center, all these spaces which are laid out for people or organized so that people and traffic can interact. If you think that this is the same story, they've just gone on and on for 80 years or 50, 60 years, you'll realize that there are a number of phases in this, and I'll just go rapidly through these phases. The first 20 years from 60 to 80 last century was really to promote walking and promenading, to make sure that in the city you could walk without being hindered and without being run over or harassed by the traffic. So they made the pedestrian streets, widening the sidewalks, whatever. But then came the next period, which was phase two, where between 1980 and 2000, really we started to take an interest in you should not walk all the time. People would like to sit down, to relax, to enjoy. We would also like to have culture to enter the public spaces. It was also the time when people have a bit more money so they can afford to go on restaurants. We have this period as a period of the cappuccino culture coming in. It came all over Europe, all over the world actually, and it came also with the tourism. Tourists doesn't walk all the time; they sit down. So sitting was the next phase. The third phase has been after year 2000. More and more concern about the sitting syndrome, that people are sitting too much and they are not getting enough exercise, and they die out of sitting or sitting syndrome. And the doctors say we shall move more and we shall have more fun. So you walk more, you should bicycle more, but also you could exercise more and have more fun. You could swim in the harbor, you could roller skate in the parks, you could bike on red bicycle lanes. All these we've seen as a third wave, but now we are into the fourth wave of public spaces. That is the climate adaptation. And I think that what they are doing in Copenhagen at the moment, I find it quite, as a citizen, I find it interesting, because what they're doing, they are combining two things. They are adapting areas to climate, to extreme climate, but also at the same time, they're improving the neighborhoods enormously much. So the main principle here is, which I think is important, always use your money 2 times or more. Don't go for climate adaptation only, go for more things, because you can improve the city vastly by using climate money for this. We have in Copenhagen seen more and more rainfall, cloudbursts, suddenly enormous much rain in the streets and running into the basements, very expensive. And then they, of course, have started this program. They have a number of climate districts where they figure out where the natural runoff will be. And then they start to form the whole district as one big sponge, so that when the rain comes down, the rain will be absorbed and lead into the public spaces and the streets. And what they do, all the planting they can do, so that there'll be as much absorbing as possible. They make green roofs, and then on the squares, they make wetlands. And that means that when there is a big cloudburst, all the water will assemble here, and this green area will become a wet area, will become a lake. And but the trick is, when it's not wet and when it's not full of water, it's a fantastic recreational landscape for the whole area. So the area gets generally cooler, the climate in the area, the air gets cleaner by all the planting, and the water doesn't run into the ocean. It runs into these special reservoirs where it can be transferred into the groundwater and be turned into drinking water. It's absolutely waste to take rainwater directly into the ocean, because we need the water for a number of other things. So this principle of using the money 2 times, both for recreation and having some fun, and also for absorbing the extra rain, is used in these areas. And I think that's a great idea, because in this way you can improve the city considerably, and in the same time you can also prepare for some situations which could give you quite many disastrous hours. So the main principle here is use your money 2 times or more. In this case, they use them for climate adaptation, for greening the city, and for creating more place for recreation and for playgrounds. There's something here for everyone. And never forget that wet children are happy children. And in these climate districts, there will be more wet children than in the rest of Copenhagen. I end here, but I have a little special bonus slide I brought here with a greeting to Anton Kulbachevsky.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Ян Гейл. Спасибо за ваше выступление.
Jan Gil, thank you very much. We do know that you are a great expert, and you always promote the idea of cycling, but now you expanded the list of solutions which could help us with adaptation. We were planning the discussion, but unfortunately, due to our limit constraints, we won't be able to have a talk. We won't be able to have the discussion. That's why I'll just thank everyone who was talking to us today. Thank you for your time, for your expertise, for your knowledge. I am absolutely sure that we learned a lot of things. We know how cities can invest into cities, making them more resilient. We were thinking about new risks which will be there. We will know about some global consequences, about possible adaptation and mitigation programs. We know which technological solutions help us to make our cities healthier and more sustainable, more flexible in front of future changes. This year has demonstrated that our life can change very quickly. Our habits can change rapidly. This is valuable experience. Let's hope that this experience that we had in 2020, we can take with us into the future, thinking about climate risks. We can think about some steps for the future. It was great to see that such cities as Singapore, Vancouver, Moscow, Zurich, Copenhagen are implementing these programs for adaptation to the climate and making cities more resilient. Let's continue working together. Let's continue sharing our experience in the future. Thank you very much, dear friends. I hope to see you soon again. Have a good evening.